Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
We've pulled together a stack of, well, really fascinating sources today to properly dig into a topic that's pretty much all around us. It impacts global agriculture, the food we eat, sometimes without us even realizing it, genetically modified organisms, GMOs.
That's right. And we've got quite a mix on the table. There's official info from the FDA, a pretty dense scientific review article, and also a perspective from an environmental group, Friends of the Earth. Different angles.
Exactly. And our mission here really is to get past the headlines. We want to sift through all this material, pull out the key bits of knowledge. The goal is to give you a clearer picture what GMOs are, why farmers use them, the impacts, both good and bad, where the controversies really lie, and maybe where this tide of heading.
It's definitely complex.
It is.
Oh,
But that's why we're doing this deep dive.
absolutely. And I think it's crucial to start with some history because modern genetic modification, the lab stuff, that feels new. But fundamentally, changing plants, humans have been doing that for like 10,000 years.
10,000 years. Wow. So you mean things like selective breeding?
Exactly. Farmers picking the best plants, maybe the ones with the biggest seeds, or that survived a drought and saving those seeds. Just doing that over and over.
Slowly changing the plant over generations.
Precisely. That artificial selection is how we got modern crops. The sources mentioned teosinte, this wild grass, and how it was gradually transformed into the corn we eat today. They look completely different.
That's incredible when you think about it on that time scale. So when did the modern stuff, the actual engineering in labs, kick off?
Much more recently, the groundwork starts mid-20th century, discovering genetic material could be transferred, figuring out the DNA double helix.
The big breakthroughs.
Right. But the real game changer for engineering came in the 1970s. Techniques to actually, cut and paste specific bits of DNA. The sources call it using molecular scissors and glue.
That's a good visual. And that allowed scientists to insert genes from one species into another.
Exactly. First genetically engineered plants pop up in 1983. Lab experiments mostly, like tobacco modified to resist an antibiotic. China actually commercialized GM tobacco in the early 90s.
Good.
But for food, the big milestone was 1994, the Flav Savarit tomato. First GM food approved by the FDA. It was designed to ripen more slowly.
The slow ripening tomato, I remember that. And that kind of opened the floodgates, didn't it? Mid-90s, you see corn, cotton, soybeans, canola.
That's when it really took off commercially, yes. Which brings us to the big question. Why did farmers actually adopt these GM seeds so widely? What was the appeal on the ground?
Well, looking at the sources, it seems pretty fundamental. Basically, preventing crop loss, protecting their investment.
Makes sense.
The scientific review boils it down to three main traits early on: resistance to insect damage, tolerance to herbicides, and resistance to plant viruses.
Right. And those directly tackled huge headaches for farmers. Insect resistance, for instance, often using genes from a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, that's where bolete crops comes from.
Oh, okay.
The plant makes its own insecticide, basically, targeting specific pests. So farmers could spray much less, or sometimes not at all.
Which means lower costs and, potentially less environmental impact from those sprays.
Yeah.
What about herbicide tolerance?
That was huge, too. It lets farmers spray a broad-spectrum herbicide, like Roundup, to kill weeds without killing their crop. Changed weed control completely.
How so?
Well, one big benefit mentioned is it made no-till or reduced-till farming much easier. You control weeds with chemicals, not plowing, and less plowing is generally better for soil health, reduces erosion, saves fuel.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. And the virus resistance, there was that really striking example, wasn't there? Saving a whole industry. Yeah. The rainbow papaya in Hawaii, papaya ring spot virus, was absolutely devastating the crop there, just wiping it out.
Wow.
So scientists engineered a virus-resistant papaya, introduced it in 1998, and it basically saved the industry. A really clear case of GM providing a vital solution.
That's a powerful story. So, okay, those are farm-level benefits. But the scientific review, it tried to quantify the bigger picture, right, globally, from 96 to 2013.
Yes, and the numbers they report are pretty eye-opening. Over that period, they estimate GM crops added over 370 million tons to global food production. That's a significant yield boost.
370 million tons, that's a lot of food.
What about pesticide use? Did it go down?
They reported a 37% reduction in the amount of active ingredient used in pesticides globally.
37%.
Yeah. And they calculated this led to about an 18% reduction in the overall environmental impact from insecticide and herbicide use.
Okay, significant numbers. And economically, was there a benefit for farmers overall?
A massive one, according to their estimate. They put the cumulative global farm income benefit between 1996 and 2013 at about $117.6 billion.
Wow. Okay, that figure alone helps explain why adoption was so widespread, despite, the public debates.
Absolutely. It suggests a strong economic incentive for farmers, and they included specific case studies to illustrate this, like cotton in India.
Right, tell us about that.
Cotton's crucial in India. About 8 million farmers depend on it, many farming small plots. And the pink bollworm pest was a huge problem, requiring tons of insecticide.
Okay.
When blute cotton, resistant to the bollworm, came in around 2002, the impact was dramatic. Farmers saw big jumps in profit, higher yields.
So real money in their pockets.
Yes, the review mentions grower consumption spending went up 18%. It directly improved livelihoods, helped reduce poverty in those cotton-growing areas.
That's a powerful point, the impact on millions of smallholders.
It really is, and it scaled up. India's whole agri-biotech sector grew massively. India overtook China as a top cotton grower and exporter. Yields up 31% nationally. Insecticide use on cotton cut by more than half.
Wow.
The review even calls that period, 2002 to 2011, a white gold period for Indian GM cotton.
White gold. That really captures the transformation. What about the other example, Australia?
Yeah, GM canola in Australia. Canola is important there for crop rotation, but it struggles with weeds and diseases. Herbicide-resistant GM canola varieties were introduced around 2008.
Similar story. Helped manage weeds.
Exactly. Adoption climbed, especially in Western Australia. It gave farmers a much better tool for controlling tough weeds, boosting the overall biotech crop area in the country. So these cases kind of ground those big global numbers in real-world farming.
Okay, so the review really emphasizes farm-level benefits, yields, less spraying, more income. Do the sources talk much about impacts beyond the farm? For consumers, maybe?
The FDA source touches on that a bit. I mean, indirectly, if you increase supply and efficiency, food might become more accessible, maybe more affordable. That's a potential consumer benefit.
Right.
And there are some GMOs developed specifically for consumers.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
They mention a GMO soybean that produces healthier cooking oil. And there's that non-browning GMO apple.
The apple that doesn't go brown.
Right. The idea there is pretty straightforward. If sliced apples stay looking good longer, maybe less gets thrown out, could help reduce food waste.
Interesting angle. And this isn't just a U.S. thing, right? These efforts are global.
Definitely. USAID works with other countries using genetic engineering on their key staple crops, like insect-resistant eggplant in Bangladesh, been slowly rolled out since 2014.
And how's that going?
Reports suggest farmers are earning less crop loss, and crucially, they have less pesticide exposure because they're spraying way less than they used to on traditional eggplant.
That's a direct win for farmer health and income.
Exactly, and there's similar work on things like virus-resistant cassava, insect-resistant cowpea, blight-resistant potato in places across Africa and Asia, often targeting problems that devastate crops for subsistence farmers.
Okay, so that paints a picture of, well, pretty significant benefits, especially for farmers and some consumer potential. But we know GM crops are hugely controversial. Some countries even ban them. What are the big controversies the sources highlight?
Yeah, it's definitely not all smooth sailing. There's been major pushback. One big historical flashpoint the review discusses was the monarch butterfly issue back in 1999.
Oh, right. I vaguely remember that. Pollen-harming butterflies.
That was the initial fear. A lab study suggested pollen from a certain bait corn variety could harm monarch larvae if it landed on their food source, milkweed.
And monarchs feed on milkweed near cornfields, right?
Exactly. So the worry was monarch migration paths cross the corn belt. The pollen falls when larvae are feeding, potential for widespread harm.
Sounds pretty scary for the monarchs. What happened with that?
Well, this is where it gets complex. According to the review, follow-up research challenged those initial conclusions. Scientists look closer at real-world conditions.
Like how much pollen actually ends up on milkweed leaves in a field.
Right. Things like rain washing it off, how it disperses. The conclusion from several later studies was that the actual risk to the overall monarch population was likely very low, even with lots of bleat corn being grown, affecting maybe a tiny fraction of a %.
So the initial lab study raised awareness, But the real-world impact wasn't as dire as feared.
That seems to be the takeaway from this scientific review. It highlighted the need to look at non-target effects, but the specific risk from brought corn pollen to monarchs wasn't ultimately seen as a major population threat.
Okay, was there another major scientific blow-up mentioned?
Oh, yes, the Seralini affair in 2012.
Yeah.
That one is still debated fiercely today. It involved a study feeding rats Roundup-ready corn GM, corn resistant to Roundup herbicide and also Roundup itself.
And the results were not good.
They were shocking, frankly. The study reported serious health problems in the rat's kidney, liver damage, higher death rates, and lots of tumors appearing earlier than normal.
Wow.
The authors blamed the GM corn and the herbicide, and they called for much longer safety studies on all GM foods.
That must have caused a huge reaction.
Massive. But the scientific community's reaction was largely critical, very critical. Experts pointed out major flaws, they said, in the study design, like using a rat strain known to get tumors anyway, small sample sizes for the conclusions drawn, issues with the statistics.
Flaws serious enough, too.
Serious enough that the journal eventually retracted the paper. They said the data didn't robustly support the conclusions, but controversially, the study was later republished in a different journal.
So it's still out there.
It is. And despite the heavy scientific criticism and retraction, its findings are still widely cited by GMO opponents. It really shows how polarizing these issues can become and how difficult it is to resolve them once they're in the public domain.
Right. Beyond those specific studies, the review calls GM crops an imperfect technology.
Yeah.
What kinds of potential risks does it mention more generally?
Well, it acknowledges theoretical risks.
Right.
Things like, could the new protein be toxic or allergenic? Could inserting the gene mess up other genes in the plant? Potential genetic hazards?
And did any of those potential risks actually cause a problem in the real world, like an allergen issue?
Yes. The Starlink maize incident is a really important example of things going wrong. Starlink was a type of beet corn from the late 90s. The FDA had concerns it might be allergenic to humans.
Okay.
So they approved it only for animal feed and industrial use. Strictly not for people to eat.
Cute, separate. Makes sense.
But somehow, even though not much was planted, Starlink DNA turned up in human food products, taco shells, other things, in the U.S. internationally.
Oh, wow. How did that happen?
It highlighted just how hard it can be to keep grain segregated throughout the whole supply chain, from farm to elevator to processor to shelf. It led to huge recalls, over 300 products in the U.S., really shook the corn market, depressed prices, a major wake-up call about containment and unintended consequences.
Yeah, that sounds like a mess. Another issue you mentioned earlier was pest resistance, insects evolving to beat the break crops.
Exactly. That's a huge ongoing challenge. It's basic evolution. If you constantly expose insects to the same toxin, eventually some will develop resistance, and the beet crop stops working as well.
And is that happening?
Yes. The review cited analysis showing that by 2013, resistance was reducing the effectiveness of beet crops against several major pests. It can happen surprisingly fast.
Like how fast?
Well, they mentioned fall armyworm resistance to a type of boot maize popping up in the U.S. after just 3 years. They had to withdraw that product in Puerto Rico. And in India, pink bollworm resistance is now a serious problem again for many beet cotton farmers.
So the technology needs constant management to stay effective. It's not a one-and-done fix.
Definitely not. It underlines that these need careful stewardship strategies to preserve their usefulness.
Okay, now shifting focus a bit. One of our sources, the one from Friends of the Earth, is pretty critical not just of these older GMOs, but also raises alarms about the newer stuff, CRISPR, synthetic biology.
Yes, their perspective is, well, quite cautionary. They worry these new technologies are being overhyped as easy solutions, maybe like they feel the first GMOs were. They point to things like increased herbicide use with the first generation as an example of unintended consequences.
So what's their main concern with this next wave?
Their core message is, slow down. Let's really understand the health, environmental, and social justice impacts before we race ahead. They feel the industry is pushing forward too fast, often marketing things as sustainable or natural without full safety checks, regulations, or clear labels.
Do they give examples of products they're concerned about?
They do. They mention the Impossible Burger, specifically the genetically engineered heme protein that gives it its meaty taste. They cite FDA documents where they claim the FDA itself expressed concern that the company's safety studies weren't conclusive, mentioning potential allergenicity and finding unexpected proteins.
And their point is, It's being sold despite those questions.
That's their assertion, yes.
Yeah.
That safety wasn't fully established before it hit the market.
What about the vanillin example?
Right. Vanilla flavoring made using genetically engineered yeast. It's marketed as natural and sustainable. Friends of the Earth disputes that. They argue natural is misleading, legally undefined.
Yeah.
But their bigger issue is social justice. This GE vanillin competes with actual vanilla beans grown by smallholder farmers, often in sensitive rainforest areas. They worry this lab-grown alternative could undercut those farmers' livelihoods and harm those ecosystems.
So their critique hits on potential health risks, environmental unknowns, and these broader socioeconomic impacts on traditional agriculture and communities.
Exactly. It's a fundamentally different vision. They argue against investing in what they see as risky, patented, corporate-controlled GE products. Instead, they advocate for supporting organic, transparent, socially just food production systems that benefit farmers, workers, and the environment directly.
It's clear there are deep disagreements and real challenges. But the scientific review did talk about ways to manage some of the problems, like Starlink or pest resistance, didn't it?
Yes, it discusses mitigation. For contamination like Starlink, suggestions include tighter regulations, buffer zones between crop types, better lab testing for potential problems, and involving more stakeholders in decisions.
And for managing that pest resistance issue.
Several strategies. Things like ensuring high doses of the beet toxin in the plants, monitoring insect populations closely, breeding crops with other natural resistance traits, making sure farmers plant those non-beet refuge areas nearby.
The refuges slow down resistance evolution, right?
That's the idea. And also proactively using crops with multiple beet toxins pyramids, making it much harder for pests to develop resistance to all of them at once. It's an ongoing management effort.
So looking forward, what do the sources say about where GM agriculture is heading? Trends, research.
Well, the market for GM seeds is expected to keep growing, but a really striking point in the review is the industry consolidation.
Meaning fewer, bigger companies.
Massively fewer. A huge chunk of the market is controlled by just a handful of giants. They mention the Big Five, but note that huge mergers, Bayer buying Monsanto, CanChina buying Syngenta, Dow and DuPont merging, are constantly concentrating that power.
That level of control has implications in itself. Where's the research focus within these big companies?
Still a lot on the classic traits, insect resistance, yield, herbicide tolerance. But there's also growing investment in newer, more precise techniques like CRISPR.
The gene editing tool.
Right. It allows for much more targeted changes to a plant's DNA, potentially with fewer unintended side effects compared to older methods. That's the hope anyway.
Does that precision open up new possibilities? New types of traits?
Definitely. Two big areas highlighted are biofortification and stress tolerance. Biofortification is about boosting the nutritional value of staple crops.
Like adding vitamins.
Exactly. Think vitamin A in golden rice, though its rollout has been complex. But also boosting iron or zinc in crops like rice or cassava to fight micronutrient deficiencies, which affect billions of people.
That seems hugely important. And stress tolerance. Relevant for climate change, I assume.
Absolutely critical. Developing crops that can better handle drought, heat, salty soils. As weather gets more extreme and land resources shrink, crops that can survive tough conditions are essential. There's already drought-tolerant corn on the market and lots of research on other crops.
Okay, so despite all the controversies, the challenges, the industry concentration, the criticisms from groups like Friends of the Earth, the scientific sources still see potential for GM tech to help tackle big agricultural problems.
That seems to be the overall message from the review, reflecting a broad scientific consensus. The tools can offer benefits for productivity, maybe nutrition, adapting to climate change, but realizing that potential responsibly requires careful science, strong regulation, ongoing monitoring, open communication, and addressing those real public and social concerns. It's not simple.
So we've dived into the FDA view, the scientific literature, the environmental critique. Bringing it back to our listener, what does this whole complex tapestry of GMOs mean for you?
I think it really shows how tangled everything is, doesn't it? Technology, science, business, policy, history, even social values. They all intersect right there on your plate and in the fields growing your food. It underlines the tricky balance we're always trying to strike. How do we use innovation to tackle huge challenges feeding everyone, dealing with climate change while also managing the risks, the environmental impacts, the ethical questions, and making sure the benefits are shared fairly?
Yeah. We went from ancient farmers saving the best seeds all the way to CRISPR gene editing. We saw the big farm benefits, the global stats, But also the monarch scare, the Seralini study, the Starlink mess, the challenge of resistance. We looked at the powerful industry and the potential of future tech like biofortification.
It's definitely a lot to take in. So many different angles.
It is. And maybe that leaves you with this final thought to chew on. We see the potential benefits, more food, maybe less spraying sometimes, maybe more nutritious crops. But we also see the challenges: resistance, safety questions, control issues, social impacts. So how do we navigate this? How do we make sure that these powerful genetic tools are used in ways that genuinely help people and the planet?
It's definitely not a simple yes or no question.
Not at all. It demands we keep learning, keep asking critical questions about our food system, where it comes from, and where it's going.